On December 2nd, 1990, a couple walking along a rural dirt road in McDonald County, Missouri, was collecting cans when they discovered the corpse of a woman near an abandoned farmhouse. They called the authorities, and sheriff deputies were sent to the scene, where they noted the woman was hogtied using 6 different types of rope. But her body was so badly decomposed, it was hard to tell much of anything else about the victim or what happened to her. After the initial crime scene investigation, the corpse was sent off for an autopsy, where coroners concluded the body belonged to a white female who was in her mid to late 20s. They also determined the victim was definitely killed by someone else, and she had been lying there outside for about 6 weeks before her discovery. The different types of rope that were used on the woman included nylon and lead ropes, paracord, clothesline, and coaxial and telephone wires. Detectives were able to determine the paracord to be a military-grade type that was only issued to people in the military in the 90s, so the perp was either in the military or knew someone who was. There was also evidence that the victim had been physically violated by a male. Now, the trickiest thing about this case is that detectives weren't able to identify who this woman was. She didn't have any personal items on her that would reveal her identity. You know, like those cases where people are found with their ID or passport or something. Sadly, this one wasn't that simple. And officers did the whole look through the missing persons database thing. No matches. At the actual crime scene, there was a whole team of sheriffs, highway patrol officers, anthropologists, and other members of law enforcement, but none of them were able to find any solid clues about the victim or perp. Over the next several years, officers received calls from people across the country calling in tips about the victim's identity. But each time, they'd look up the dental records and test the DNA of the leads, and none of them matched. In the early 2000s, the unknown female corpse was given the name Grace Doe by one of the detectives on the case. The detective said she gave the woman that name because she thought it was only by the grace of God that her true identity would ever be found. In 2009, Grace's remains were sent to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System for an extensive DNA profile to be created. It was run past all of the profiles in CODIS, or the Combined DNA Index System. No matches. A facial reconstruction was made of Grace and plastered everywhere, and still, no positive IDs were made. At that point, the investigators were beyond defeated. Grace's case was so cold, they just assumed it would never be solved. As sad as it is, there are thousands of homicide cases that go unsolved every year. And based on the lack of evidence or clues, most everyone was convinced Grace's case would be among the ranks. But about 30 years into the case, something crazy happened. So in the fall of 2020, Othram took on Grace's case. Othram is a new tech company that has an advanced forensic laboratory used to ID victims, find missing persons, and track down suspects. The company uses the victim or suspect's DNA and runs the samples past information in ancestry websites to try and find a match, or at least a close relative to use as a lead. It's the same way the Golden State Killer was identified in 2018. So Othram thought they could do the same thing with Grace's case. They took her DNA and cleaned it up a bit to create a genetic profile. Specialists then ran Grace's profile through multiple genealogy sites and found several matches for extended family members. From there, the Othram team created a family tree of people Grace might be related to. They gave the list of possible relatives to detectives for them to reach out and see what they could find out. One of the people on the list was a woman named Danielle Pixler. Lieutenant Mike Hall found her number and gave her a call. When the phone rang, Danielle was at work. She picked up the phone and heard some person tell her all about a slaying. They asked her if she had a sister that was missing or something, because the DNA of Grace Doe came back as a close match for her DNA. When she first heard all of this, she thought it was a scam. But when Danielle spoke with her family, she realized the call may have been legit. Danielle called Lieutenant Hall back and started bawling. She asked him how he found out about her and knew so much about this relative. She then went on to explain that she had a sister named Shauna Garber. Shauna was in foster care in Kansas and then got transferred back to state care. But Danielle had no idea what happened to Shauna after that. For over 28 years, Danielle lived in the unknown about her long-lost sister, until this moment. So after Danielle talked to Lieutenant Hall some more, he convinced her to take a DNA test to officially find out if Grace Doe was her missing sister, Shauna. The test came back, and Danielle was a match. After nearly 30 years of Danielle searching for her sister and detectives searching for the true identity of Grace Doe, they were both able to find more answers. Now that a positive ID has been made, detectives hope to get down to the bottom of what exactly happened and who did this to Shauna. Officials were able to find out that she had a foster brother named Michael, but he passed away in a car accident in 2000, so not much came from that. Detectives are currently trying to backtrack who Shauna was by talking to her foster parents, searching for information that might help them solve the case entirely. Things like who she lived with in Kansas, what school she went to, the people she hung out with, and so on. To me, it seems like whoever did this to Shauna had to know her. The horrific way she was slain and left to decompose just makes me think someone was out to get her. Maybe a stalker or something? We also know they had to have some sort of tie to the military. But my question is, how did she end up in Missouri? I know those states are right next to each other, but it still makes me wonder what happened there. While the story of Shauna's case is far from over, the fact that a positive ID has been made is quite miraculous. And it's not the only cold case solved by genetic genealogy. Once this new technology was introduced to and utilized in law enforcement, the Metro Denver Crime Stoppers decided to try it out on 5 cold cases that involved unidentified victims or assailants. There's a former Denver district attorney named Mitch who started running United Data Connect, a company similar to Othram that tests DNA against ancestry websites to try and identify relatives of unknown individuals. So Mitch, who had experience dealing with some of these cases as a DA, went to the board president of the Metro Denver Crime Stoppers and said, "Mike, would you be willing, with your board, to fund 5 pilot programs around cold cases and genetic genealogy?" Mike said, "Mitch, that sounds great." So Mike was able to gather $20,000 for United Data Connect to try out as a sort of pilot on 5 cold cases from the area. First up, I'll tell you about Sylvia Quayle's case. On the morning of August 3rd, 1981, Sylvia was found deceased in her home. She was just 34 years old, and her own father is the one that discovered her. Investigators noted Sylvia wasn't wearing any clothing and had been slashed, strangled, physically violated, and fired at with bullets. At the crime scene, detectives collected 140 pieces of evidence. There was DNA evidence on Sylvia's rug that officials pulled a sample of. Detectives believed this DNA belonged to Sylvia's attacker, and if they determined who it belonged to, an arrest could be made. But that's the thing, they didn't know whose DNA it was at the time. But come 2021, Mitch decided to take on the case. He said, "When I read this case and realized that her father found her in the condition that I know she was in, the way that she was left after being brutalized and killed, I can't imagine. As a father myself of a young woman about this age, to have a mourning like that." With that, he vowed to do the best he could do to find out who did this to Sylvia using the new genealogy testing. The company took the DNA sample that was collected from the rug all those years ago and got it sequenced. From there, they uploaded the date into 2 ancestry websites. Then they found relatives of the perp and looked through newspapers and public records to try and narrow things down. Detectives eventually landed on one suspect, a man named David Dwayne Anderson. Investigators tracked him down and were able to snatch 2 bags of trash he had thrown out. They tested a DNA sample found on a used can of vanilla Coke. And just like that, the case was solved. David was a match for the Coke can DNA. Once the discovery was made, officers arrested David for killing Sylvia. He is still awaiting trial, but he will be charged under the laws that were in place when Sylvia was slain in 1981. That means he's looking at up to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 20 years. If he were charged under today's laws, he'd be facing an automatic life sentence. Here's another story from this batch of cold cases in Colorado. One June day in 1993, local authorities were notified about a body found at a makeshift campsite in Douglas County. Just like Grace Doe's case, this woman's corpse was in bad condition, so they couldn't ID her, and detectives weren't able to find any clues at the scene to help them. So she was buried as a Jane Doe, and for years her case went cold. In 2012, her remains were exhumed for DNA testing. Officials ran the sample through a national DNA database, but there were no matches. The following year, a sketch was made of what Jane Doe may have looked like. No leads. But in 2020, Jane's DNA was tested against ancestry websites, and thanks to this new way of tracking people down, a match was made. Jane Doe was identified as Becky Redeker, a 20-year-old woman who spent most of her life in Colorado Springs. Investigators have yet to find out who her attacker is, but at least they're able to give Becky's family some closure. And hey, they're one step closer in the process of finding the perp. The last case I'll tell you about today is Helene Prezinskis. Helene was a 21-year-old aspiring journalist who attended Wheaton College in Massachusetts. In January of 1980, Helene was doing an internship at a radio station in Denver with her friend and classmate, Kitsy. She and Kitsy were both staying with Helene's aunt and uncle for the internship. On January 16th, Helene's shift ended at 5:30 p.m. Just like every night, she got off and headed home on a route that included walking a few blocks, taking a bus, and walking several more blocks to her family's house, arriving right around 6:30 p.m. This particular night, Helene didn't arrive on time. Her aunt, uncle, and gal pal Kitsy were all super worried. It wasn't like Helene to not come home, especially without giving them a heads up that she was going to be late or something. The threesome decided to immediately take action. They drove along Helene's route to look for her, searched at the bus stop, and called the radio station she was working at. After no hits, they notified the cops and filed a missing persons report. The following morning, a woman was driving down the road when her 13-year-old son shouted, "Mom, there's a body out there." She turned her head and looked out to the field where she saw patches of snow and what appeared to be a body. The woman then found some guy who was driving a big machine along the side of the road and asked him to check it out. The guy approached the body and confirms that it was the body of a lifeless human, so he called 911 to report it. Officers arrived at the scene and determined the woman was Helene. They found her in the field with her hands tied behind her. There were clear signs of her being violated by a male and slashed all over. Investigators collected the perp's DNA samples from Helene's body and clothing, but back then, not much could be done. Here were the other clues found at the crime scene. Tracks in the dirt from a car and cowboy boots, which they made a plaster cast of, an empty milk carton, a piece of bread, and an old can. Once Helene's story hit the news, a woman contacted the police saying she was driving down that road the night of the crime and mentioned seeing a man near the field Helene was found in. The witness said the guy was a white 20 to 30-year-old with brown hair and a mustache. She was later brought in for hypnosis, where she was able to spill more details about the guy she saw. From that, a suspect sketch was made and released to the public. But if you can't already tell the trend of this episode, this mock-up didn't produce any solid leads. The tricky thing about this case is Helene had only been in Colorado for about 2 to 3 weeks for her internship. She was originally from the East Coast. Based on the brutality of this case, it seemed like the assailant would know her well. But 2 weeks is a short amount of time to become close with anyone, so this was committed by someone at random. A few weeks before this crime, a woman was physically violated by a male close to where Helene was found. Detectives theorized these two attacks were carried out by the same person. Who? They didn't know. In 1998, Douglas County's Sheriff's Office reopened Helene's case. They combed through all of the evidence, and that's when they found out none of it had ever been tested for DNA. So of course, the investigators tested the DNA and ran it through CODIS. No match. The case was re-examined in 2000, 2005, 2008, and 2013. But in 2017, the DNA from Helene's case was uploaded into several genealogy websites, and there were a bunch of relative matches. From there, officials dwindled things down until they found their suspect, James Clanton. They learned that 2 years after Helene's slaying, James changed his name to Curtis Allen White. Detectives were able to pull DNA from a beer glass Curtis drank from at a bar, and that's where the speculations were confirmed. This was their dude. In December of 2019, Curtis was arrested. He confessed to the crime within 2 months, and by July, Curtis went to trial where he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. A cold case detective who worked on Helene's case said, "We had our traditional techniques that we used and we couldn't get anywhere with those. This new tool gave us the opportunity to reopen the case and identify a suspect. It's been a remarkable tool for detectives to utilize."